back to this I-24 News Evening Edition. This is the Daily Debate. Well, a day after the whirlwind struck the Ukraine, the world is waiting for the dust to settle and to see where the country may be headed. Well, for now, we're left to ask who will be the new face of the Ukrainian leadership. Well, to answer some of our questions, with me today is Dr. Olen Bagno Alex Selsky. Thank you for joining us here tonight.
Good to be here.
And research fellow and Ukraine expert at the INSS think tank, and Alex Selsky, former Russian language media advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. Again, thank you both for being here tonight. Hope to shed some light on some of the events taking place in the Ukraine. Certainly a lot to talk about here in this topic. Yesterday, an exciting day. You could call it that. Obviously, exciting may not be the right term. People have died leading up to the events of yesterday. A solemn event, but nevertheless capped by some exciting things. Seeing Timoshenko on stage there addressing the crowds. How did both of you feel? We'll start with you, Alex. How did you feel seeing those images yesterday of Timoshenko in a wheelchair on the stage addressing all the protesters there? Did it move you in some way?
Well, first of all, I think the first thought that I had is again and again, those who try to predict such things in the international arena, they just cannot do so. We could not predict what happened in the Arab states and in Egypt, twice. And I don't think that anybody could 2, 3, 4 months ago think that it will lead into this kind of crisis, this kind of almost a war, and release of Timoshenko and escape of Yanukovych. Everybody spoke that Putin again won another battle. I think that it's very, very, very early to determine what's happening with Ukraine. Even though I think that not too much happened, not too much changed, because I think Ukraine is still in the same very, very complex dilemma between Russia and Europe. By the way, it's not new. I think it's about 500 years maybe.
Do you agree or disagree? How did it leave you feeling? Yesterday it was just filled with such dramatic imagery here as Yanukovych fled the capital, Timoshenko's on the stage there addressing people. It felt like a victory for the opposition. Do you see it that way?
I wouldn't see it as a victory for the opposition. I would definitely see it as a victory for certain people in the opposition. But opposition in Ukraine, we have to remember that it's not a homogeneous thing. It consists of very many different parts, and these parts sometimes disagree. And I have to say that these dramatic changes that we saw yesterday were the result of this disagreement, because if you remember, 2 days ago they signed a peace deal with Yanukovych, and the opposition leaders, the oppositional triad, Klitschko, Tyahnybok, and Yatsenyuk, they were ready for concessions and they were ready for peace, while the opposition, the real opposition who were standing on the square, decided the other way, and this is the results we saw yesterday.
Was there a feeling that these protests, as they got more violent and more active, were they hijacked to some degree by extremists that were looking for this kind of a fight, that thrive off of this kind of violence or disarray?
Well, I think this kind of violence, always kind of hijacked by extremists. I'm sure, in Ukraine and in Russia, in Eastern Europe, always, we had this kind of gangs and criminals. So, I think that alongside with the real dilemma, real struggle for identity for Ukrainian people, always, there is robberies and criminals. So definitely, it's always part of it. By the way, we saw it, in every crisis. We saw it in the 90s in Russia very much. So definitely it's part of it, unfortunately. And by the way, anti-Semitism is definitely, again, a part of it.
You're saying anti-Semitism appeared in this protest movement to some degree.
It's part of it. Always when we see a search for struggle for identity in Eastern Europe in general and in Ukraine in particular, somehow Jews at the end will be hurt.
Will be blamed, huh?
Unfortunately, this is again the case, and we hope that it will not happen again, that Jews will not be part of it and will not be thought of as part of the opposition, or part of any side.
So we want to stay out of the issue here. Well, I understand we have live images now from Kiev. We'll take a look at what's happening now down in central Kiev. Again, you're looking at live images here. As you can see, thousands of people still in the streets here, not appearing to go anywhere. Do either of you think that what we'll see next in this country and the form of government will be a pro-Western or open to the EU to some degree?
I think that the next unity government is going to be a pro-EU government, definitely, because they realize that the next step, if it's going to be a pro-Russian government, then they are not going to stay in power, definitely. And I have to pick on that take on the Jewish community. I do not think that Jewish community, again, is a homogeneous entity in Ukraine, and part of the Jewish community, part of the Jewish leaders were staying on Maidan and addressing people, and they were with the opposition. So I would not take it as a black and white picture. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you feel the same way, that we're probably heading towards a pro-Western government in the Ukraine? It's just too hard to say.
I definitely think that it will be much more pro-European angle, but again, I think that Ukraine still is kind of, prisoned in a dilemma of an option that they want but cannot. This is the European option, and the option that they can but don't want. This is the Russian option,
Okay.
if to generalize the dilemma. So I definitely think that this is kind of a shift toward Europe. I don't think that the result can be capable of being, pro-European. See the gas agreement with Russia. I don't see that Ukraine will be released from it very, very quickly.
Well, as Yanukovych fled the capital over the weekend here and basically went to where his power base is in the east, how much power did he actually take with him, if any? Is he now completely sidelined, or does he still have the ability to sway events in Ukraine?
I think that tomorrow is going to be the decisive day probably for Yanukovych, because we already know that he tried to leave the country through Donetsk, and this is his power post in eastern Ukraine, and he was not allowed to. So he'll probably try to cross the border, if at all, tomorrow. And if we do not hear about that, I think that he's going to have a hard time in Ukraine, within Ukraine, because there are some parts of the society who want to see him trialed. On the other hand, the other part of the society, including the former presidents, all the ex-presidents, would not want to see him in prison, because this is not a European way of treating your former president. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you go to the European choice, then that has to be European choice until the end, and that's probably the dilemma that the opposition is now facing.
What remains in the parliament now? The various power factions that are still involved haven't fled the city. Do they have power? Do they still have?
They're coming back, by the way.
What's that?
Some of them are coming back.
Coming back.
The Party of Regions, some of them are coming back. The key figures, including the former Speaker of the Parliament, is back to work.
As they sense perhaps things have calmed down a little bit in Kiev.
Absolutely. I do think that they're trying to see what is the remaining power that they can get back.
Very interesting. What's your take on that in terms of the parliament that remains today? Do they have some teeth? Are they able to actually make things move forward now? They've called elections. What's next for them?
Well, we saw that they can. The last 2 days they did, more than they did, I think, for the last maybe 5 years, wow. Definitely. Releasing former prime minister and taking responsibility from Yanukovych. But yet, really, I think that we in the press we like to judge things very fast. But we already saw. I don't want to compare, but we already saw another regimes not so far from here. That we thought that it will go away in 2 months, and now it's more than 2 years. And we saw others who we thought just 3 months ago that they will, have a very stable regime, and now they're out fleeing. We don't know where.
We've seen mayhem across the world, essentially, specifically in the Middle East.
I don't want anybody now to predict, to be too much sure of his prediction. Let's see. Again, I don't think really now that Ukraine has a very new situation. They have maybe a little shift. Unfortunately, I don't see a big change in this really kind of a prison dilemma that the Ukrainian people have.
Do you think that the issue now has become more complex than it was at the beginning of this protest movement, whereas the EU, sort of the East versus West situation, has it evolved? Has it become more complex than that now?
I think it's more complex, because if the West thought about receiving Ukraine into the EU. Now, maybe from one hand, we will say, that Tymoshenko is out, so, at least one of three conditions is solved, but I don't think that now the public opinion in the West is very, sympathetic to Ukraine. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't see a big change.
What's your take on that? Do you think that there's
I would say that I would agree with Alex on their no big change in their offing, because the faces that we see are the faces that were associated with power elites of the previous regime. They were simply not within the inner circle of the president. And this is probably the greatest drama of Ukrainian opposition, because there's no grassroots leader who would be able to unite the country and lead it like the Václav Havel type of a leader. So that's one thing. Your question was on the complexity of the...
how that has become more complex now than just a tug of war between the East and West.
It's definitely become more complex and more dramatic, but I would also say that now the European responsibility towards Ukraine is much higher, because at this point, Europe and the whole world knows that Ukrainians are ready to sacrifice their lives for the European choice. And for the change, And this time for the Europeans, it will be much more difficult to explain why they do not want Ukraine, or why they decided not to put more pressure on Putin and on the United States to probably change the requirements of the International Monetary Fund and, to ease the economic conditions in Ukraine.
Well, you mentioned the key players here involved, the external players, Russia, the U.S., the West, within the European Union. What will Russia do now? I mean, we have to ask that question now. It seems that up till now, the Russians have outplayed the West in this whole situation in Ukraine. They came ready for the situation more than the Europeans. What will Putin do now?
I think he will just proceed pressing. First of all, it's a very symbolic timing. We're speaking exactly on the time of the ceremony, closing ceremony of Sochi Olympic Games. So, Russians have, their meal of pride for this moment. I think that Putin will just press further, and I think that it will work for him because it worked for him, before. I don't think that he has more instruments. The public opinion, though, we definitely see within Ukraine is toward the West, but again,
how much does he stand to lose?
Again, they may want to be European, but they want to eat something as well.
Is there a possibility here? This may sound extreme, but one has to ask, seeing events from history here involving Russia, is there a possibility of the Russians sending troops into eastern Ukraine under some premise of protecting or restoring order to a situation that's out of control?
My take on that will be no, definitely no. No chance, because for two reasons. First, it's gonna kill all the public image of President Putin, and he would not do that. Second, it will not reach the goal, because Ukraine is not Georgia, and the conflict is entirely internal conflict. And then Putin has a much more effective ways of influencing the situation, which is an economic leverage that he is using until now. He is now postponing to the purchase of the last Eurobonds and until the unity government is formed. And nobody knows if he's going to keep his promise of the gas price of $238 instead of $400. So, he has a lot of room for maneuver in economic terms. He doesn't need that.
How much of a surprise were these events at large within the Ukraine? Do you think that prior to a few months ago, anyone saw this coming in the Ukraine?
I think definitely not. I assume that most of the people, most of the experts thought that Yanukovych, will stay in power, and Putin will have enough pressure and enough economic pressure to win. It's a real surprise, and I agree with the fact that no Russian troops will come into Ukraine. It's impossible. You cannot sell this idea to Russian people. It's almost brothers. Ukraine and Russia are like brothers. You will not sell it. And again, Putin has enough pressure and enough gas prices to press.
Well, very interesting. Thank you both for being here tonight and contributing to the debate and to the topic that's captivating the world. Well, thank you, Alex Selsky and Olen Bagno Alex Selsky. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And that wraps up the debate. Stay tuned for the headlines. We'll see you after that.